I noticed that something has been off with my dad lately. Not in the way he interacted with us, no, to the outside world. He was the epitome of a doting father, present at every soccer game, always up for a late-night ice cream run, and the king of bad dad jokes. But beneath a veneer of suburban normalcy, I could sense something darker, something meticulously concealed. The first real hint of Dad's secret came on a muggy evening in July. I was supposed to be a Jenna sleepover, but I had forgotten my inhaler, so I sneaked back home. The house was supposed to be empty, but as I tiptoed through the back door, I heard Dad's voice, a hushed, urgent whisper that stopped me in my tracks. He was in his study, a room that always seemed to be off limits whenever he was home. I crept closer, my curiosity piqued. Through the slightly ajar door, I saw him, hunched over his desk, his back to me, speaking into his phone. "No, the package has been delivered. Yes, I left no traces. It's done," he said, his voice cold and detached, a stark contrast to the warm, jovial tone I was used to. My heart pounded in my chest. What package? Delivered where? I strained to hear more, but he hung up the phone and started shuffling papers, effectively ending my eavesdropping session. I hurried back the way I came, my mind racing with questions. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake off the unease that had settled over me. Dad continued to be his usual self, but I began to notice little things I had previously overlooked. His frequent business trips, his habit of taking calls in private, the way his demeanor changed ever so slightly when discussing work. One afternoon, when I was sure I was alone, I ventured into his study. It was as neat and orderly as he was, every book aligned, every pen in its place, but I was looking for something out of place, something that would explain that night. After a few minutes of fruitless searching, my gaze fell on a painting of a serene landscape hanging behind his desk. It looked innocuous, but something about it nagged at me. On impulse, I lifted it off the wall, and there it was, a safe. My hands trembled as I dialed random numbers hoping for a miracle, but of course, it didn't open. Frustration and fear mingled in my gut. I needed to know what was in there. The opportunity presented itself again a few days later. Dad was in the shower, and I heard the distinctive beeps of the safe from his study. I rushed over there, my heart in my throat. The safe was open, just a crack. This was it. Inside, I found stacks of cash, more money than I'd ever seen. There were several passports and IDs with Dad's picture but different names. What was my dad involved in? I carefully returned everything as it was and left the room, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was my dad, really? The loving father who made pancakes on Sundays, or this mysterious man with a safe full of secrets? I decided to keep my discovery to myself, hoping that some logical explanation would present itself. But as days turned into weeks, the image of the safe and its contents haunted me. Then, one evening, everything changed. I was doing my homework in the living room when I overheard a snippet of a news report on TV. Local businessman found dead in what police suspect to be a hit gone wrong, the anchor said. A photo flashed on the screen, a face I recognized. It was one of the men I had seen my dad meeting with a few months back, in what he had brushed off as a random encounter. I froze, a cold dread washing over me. Was it a coincidence? Was there more to Dad's business trips? The questions multiplied, each more unsettling than the last. The next day, I started digging. I combed through news archives online, looking for any clue that might connect Dad to these incidents. There were reports of sudden accidents, businessmen and local figures, all dead under mysterious circumstances. And each time, Dad had been out of town. I wanted to confide in someone, share my fears, but who would believe me? To the world, my dad was a model citizen, involved in the community, a successful businessman, a loving father. Who would suspect him of leading a double life? As the evidence mounted, so did my sense of isolation. I was living with a stranger, a man whose true nature was hidden behind a mask I had known all my life. The thought sent shivers down my spine. I knew I had to act, to uncover the truth, but deep down I feared what I might find. What if my dad really was a hitman? What if the father I loved and admired was a killer? I lay in my bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the shadows in my room morphing into sinister shapes. My life had turned into a horror story, and I had no idea how it would end. The stage was set for a revelation that would shatter my world, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was way in over my head. I couldn't escape the haunting thoughts that crept into my mind at every silent moment. The news report about the dead businessman kept replaying in my head, syncing eerily with the discovery of the safe. My father, a hitman. It sounded like something out of a crime thriller, not my life. For weeks, I watched him. I studied his comings and goings, the late-night phone calls, the hastily closed laptop screens. The more I observed, the more convinced I became that the man I called Dad was leading a sinister double life. Each time he left for a so-called business trip, my heart raced with a mix of fear and curiosity. Where was he really going? What was he actually doing? The questions swirled in my mind, unrelenting. One day, while Dad was away, I mustered the courage to search his study again. I knew it was a risk, but my need for answers outweighed my fear of being caught. I rummaged through his desk drawers, his files, his bookshelves, looking for anything that might shed light on his secret activities. That's when I found it. A small, unassuming notebook tucked away in a hidden compartment of his desk. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. It was filled with dates, times, and cryptic notes that made little sense to me. But one entry caught my eyes. It mentioned the same date as the businessman's death, with a single word beside it. Completed. My stomach churned. Was this a record of his jobs? The thought was too horrifying to contemplate, yet impossible to ignore. I carefully placed the notebook back exactly as I'd found it, my mind racing with the implications of this discovery. I needed proof, something concrete that I could take to the authorities. But what? And how? I decided to confide in my best friend Max. He listened in stunned silence as I poured out everything. The late-night calls, the safe, the notebook. I expected skepticism, disbelief, but he just nodded solemnly. "We need to find out more," Max said, his voice steady. "What if you put a tracking device in his car? We could see where he goes on these trips." The idea was bold, almost reckless, but it sparked a flicker of hope in me. It was a chance to uncover the truth, once and for all. We bought a small GPS tracker online and waited for the right moment to plant it in Dad's car. It felt like something out of a spy movie, sneaking around, plotting in whispers. But this was no movie. This was my life, and it was unraveling right before my eyes. The opportunity came one evening when Dad was absorbed in a football game on TV. My heart pounding, I slipped out to the garage and placed the tracker under the driver's seat of his car, praying he wouldn't notice. For the next few days, I monitored his movements through the tracker's app on my phone. It showed trips to the office, the grocery store, the usual mundane places. But then, he announced another business trip, and I braced myself for what I might discover. The day he left, I watched the tracker's signals move across the city, then out into the countryside, far from any known business district. It stopped at a remote location, a place I had never heard of. I couldn't shake off the sense of dread that settled over me. What was he doing out there? My imagination conjured up all sorts of sinister scenarios, each more disturbing than the last. Days passed and my dad returned home, acting as if everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Every smile, every hug felt tainted by the shadow of my suspicions. I continued to track his movements, each trip adding to the mounting evidence against him. But I needed more than just suspicious travel patterns. I needed undeniable proof. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. I was home alone one weekend, idly browsing through Dad's laptop, which he had carelessly left open. I stumbled upon a hidden folder, encrypted and password protected. My heart raced as I tried to guess the password. After several failed attempts, I typed in my birthday. And to my shock, it worked. The folder opened, revealing a trove of documents, contracts, email, cryptic references to payments and targets. It was all there, laid out in cold, hard bites. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was it, the proof I needed. My father, the man who had raised me, was a hitman. I copied everything onto a USB drive, my hands trembling. This was dangerous, I knew. If Dad found out what I had done, I had no idea how he would react. But I couldn't let this go. I had to expose him, right? For the sake of all those innocent people. I debated going to the police, but something held me back. Fear, perhaps, or the remnants of family loyalty. Instead, I decided to confront him directly. That evening, I sat across from him at the dinner table, the USB drive burning a hole in my pocket. I studied his face, searching for any sign of the killer I now knew him to be. "Dad," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know about your trips. I know what you've been doing." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice calm. I swallowed hard. "I know you're a hitman, Dad. I've seen the evidence." For a moment, there was silence. Then he laughed, a short, humorless laugh. "You've been watching way too many movies, kid," he said. But I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of fear, the realization that his secret was out. I pushed the USB drive across the table. "It's all here, Dad. Everything." He stared at it, his facade finally crumbling. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low. "I did it to protect you, to provide for us." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "How can killing people be of our protection?" I asked. He reached for the USB drive, but I snatched it back. "I'm going to the police, Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that chilled me to the core. It wasn't remorse or guilt. It was a cold, calculating assessment. "You won't do that. You know what's at stake," he said, his voice eerily calm. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, "You're not my father," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Not anymore." I left the room. I had the evidence. I had the truth. But I also had a deep, gnawing fear that things were about to get a lot worse. That night, I lay awake in bed, the shadows in my room morphing into sinister shapes once again. My life had turned into a horror story, and I was the protagonist, trapped in a plot I couldn't control. And somewhere in the darkness, I knew my father was watching, waiting. The game had changed. I was no longer just the observer. I was the target. The days following my confrontation with my dad were the longest of my life. Each hour was a tightrope walk over an abyss of fear and uncertainty. I clung to the USB drive like a lifeline, yet I hesitated to bring it to the police. The idea of exposing my father, tearing our family apart, was almost as terrifying as the truth itself. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, dissecting every word, every expression. Was there a hint of truth in his claim that he did it to protect us? Or was it just the excuse of a man cornered by his own deceptions? The doubt gnawed at me, an unrelenting, insidious whisper. In the meantime, Dad's behavior changed. He was quieter, more withdrawn. His eyes followed me around the house, shadowed by something that looked like regret, or was it calculation, perhaps? I couldn't tell anymore. One evening, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed with a message from Max. "Need to talk. Urgent." My heart skipped a beat. I slipped out of the house, the cool night air a brief respite from the stifling tension at home. Max was waiting for me at our usual spot, a secluded bench in the park. He looked serious, his usual easygoing demeanor gone. "I've been doing some digging," he said. "Your dad's name keeps popping up in some shady forums, rumors mostly, but it's clear he's not just some low-level thug." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What kind of rumors?" I asked, although I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Contracts, hits, big money," Max replied. "He's a big deal in that world. And there's something else." He paused, taking a deep breath. "There's talk of a new job, something big, and soon." The news hit me like a physical blow. Dad was planning another hit. The reality of his life, his choices crashed over me, leaving me reeling. "We need to stop him," I said. The words came out before I could think them through. Max looked at me, his expression grave. "That's not going to be easy. You're talking about going against a professional killer." I clenched my fists, feeling a surge of determination. "Well, I can't just sit back and do nothing. He's my father, but he's also a murderer." We spent hours that night, making plans, going over every possible scenario. It was surreal, like a plotting out of a movie script, except it was real, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The next day, I acted like everything was normal, and my dad seemed to be doing the same, though the air between us was charged with unspoken words and unacknowledged truths. I watched him closely, waiting for any sign of his impending job. Days passed, each more tense than the last, and then, one evening, I overheard him on the phone, his voice low and urgent. "It's set. Tomorrow night. Don't worry. It'll be clean," he said before ending the call. Tomorrow night. My heart raced. This was it, the moment of truth. I met up with Max, and we went over the plan one last time. We'd follow my dad, see where he was going, what he was planning to do, and then we'd call the police and hand over the evidence. It was risky, potentially dangerous, but I couldn't let him commit another murder. That night, I barely slept. my mind racing with what the next day would bring. It felt like standing on the edge of a precipice, the wind howling around me, urging me to jump. The following evening, I watched Dad get ready to leave. He was dressed in black, his movements methodical, precise. I waited until he was gone, then grabbed the USB drive and slipped out after him. Max was already in his car waiting, the engine idling. "Ready?" he asked, and I nodded, though my whole body was trembling. We followed my dad's car from a safe distance, the city lights blurring past us. He drove to the outskirts and then down a series of winding, deserted roads. My sense of dread grew with every mile. Finally, he pulled up to a remote warehouse, the building dark and ominous. We parked a distance away, shrouded in darkness, our eyes fixed on the lone figure making his way inside. "This is it," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We need to call the police." But as I reached for my phone, Max grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said. "Look." I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. Another car had pulled up, sleek and expensive looking. A man got out, someone I recognized from the news. A prominent politician rumored to be involved in corruption and organized crime. My mind raced. Was Dad here to kill him? Or was it something else? We watched in silence as the two men met, their conversation hidden by the distance and the darkness. Then, to my shock, they shook hands. A brief, cordial gesture that seemed at odds with everything I believed. A realization dawned on me, cold and unyielding. Dad wasn't here to kill the man. He was protecting him, guarding him against someone else. The pieces fell into place, a puzzle finally complete. Dad's business trips, his secretive behavior. He wasn't just any hitman, a murderer. He was a bodyguard, working in the shadows, protecting the powerful and the corrupt. I slumped back in my seat, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. But as I watched him standing there, a sentinel in the darkness, I realized that the truth was no less complicated. He was a man of secrets, a man who lived in a world of violence and moral ambiguity. We didn't call the police that night. We drove back in silence, the words unspoken between us. I returned home, slipping back into my room undetected. The next day, Dad was his usual self, as if nothing had happened, and I played along, the mask of normalcy firmly back in place. But something had shifted between us, a subtle but irrevocable change. I kept the USB drive, a reminder of the journey I'd taken, the truths and untruths I'd uncovered. And in the quiet moments, I wonder about the choices we make, the secrets we keep, and the shadows that linger in the hearts of those we love. Dad was not the man I thought I knew either, and perhaps in the end, that was the most unsettling truth of all. My father just asked me if I want to join him on his next business trip. I don't know. Perhaps I should.